Okay, I'm gonna be honest, my hair's a little wild, so I'm just going with it. All right, so this is episode 4 of the Losing My Religion web series that I'm so excited to be doing with my sister. And just as a reminder, we have not discussed or talked before each episode, right? So as we were putting these things together, it was very important to us to really model and show raw perspectives from two different lenses. But literally, we were raised in the same churches, the same traditions, the same cultural values, etc., and literally come from the same DNA, my sister and I. So we wanted to demonstrate the power of how differently we might all read the Bible and dive into things. And so you got a little bit of the backstory in the first couple episodes, just a very, very tip of the iceberg preview of how our faith deconstruction journey began. And we also found, for our own purposes, when we started really examining the Bible even further, I will say that I have taking courses specifically on the New Testament, the Old Testament, and other different spiritual texts that I've studied. However, disclaimer, I do not have a degree from a seminary, nor do I have an actual theological degree. I have friends that do and that are ministers, and I've also led in churches. However, that is not necessarily my background. I am a person who loves to study the Bible as well as other holy scriptures. So just putting that as a disclaimer. But in this episode, we wanted to unpack a couple women who often they are glossed over or not taught about in the Bible, and using them as a platform to actually go deeper with their story and see what exists, what people think, but our own interpretation of reading a scripture. And so this morning I spent actually a little over an hour looking at a couple different sources online, but I began with my good old New Life Application Study Bible, New International Version. A lot of times at this point, I am reading the New Living Translation, and I look at other variations of that. So one nice thing about a study Bible is it gives you some footnotes, but that's also limited to whoever wrote them and what their perspective was. So can definitely help you understand conceptually some of the more deeper things within the Bible. However, we often, myself included, there's these stories that I just don't even know about. And I think back and I'm like, why didn't we learn about them in Sunday school? Why don't I ever remember? So I've heard the term a Deborah spirit. So to get us going, Deborah was a prophetess and a judge. She was also a songwriter. So you hear a lot about David, but the only other person who was both a prophet and a judge in the Bible was Samuel. So not only did she have an impressive resume from that aspect, but she was also a songwriter. And when you see her in Judges chapter 5, the book of Judges in the Bible, that is the story that the book that most highlights who Deborah is. Her story is mainly told in chapters 4 and 5. The entire book of Judges in the Bible was Old Testament was actually detailing years of Israel's first civil war, essentially. And so you have these different people who came into leadership, and they all had different approaches, right? So Deborah was the only female judge, but she came into this space of they were going to be defeating another group of people who were essentially oppressors in Israel at the time. So following Deborah's leadership, they were in 40 years of peace again. That's how it ends. However, one thing I want to call attention to at the very end of her song that she's singing with Barak is like kind of her ride or die in this whole approach, because he says, hey, in chapter 4, and yes, Barack is also a name in the Bible, if you were wondering, just like our former president, Barack Obama. in chapter 4, Barak says to her, if you go with me, I will go, but if you don't go with me, I won't go. So it also lets you know a little bit about not only her wisdom, but her leadership capacity, in that she was a master at no, Deborah was not out there fighting on the front lines, but she was a masterful leader in that she knew how to guide and direct and encourage people and speak into their lives clearly what they were supposed to do, and be kind of that invisible hand behind the scenes. It wasn't about recognition for her. Matter of fact, even she details in chapter 4, verse 9, I'm looking down at my notes, that she basically warns Barak. So before they go on this journey and that to defeat Sisera, right, that glory would actually go to a woman. And you might read that and go, well, is she talking about herself? Is she propping herself up? Who is this? But what actually ends up happening in the story, when they go to Sisera, there's another woman, Jael, who is introduced. And I want to read it directly from the text so I don't misquote it. Jael was a man's wife, and she picked up a tent peg and hammer, and she went to where, I'm trying to find where Sisera was, right? And so Barak was coming, right, with Deborah. They were coming in pursuit, and Jael went out to meet him, and she said, come, I'll show you the man you're looking for. So what had happened previously was this Sisera had said he was thirsty. Please give me some water. So she opened a skin of milk. She gave him a drink. She covered him up and takes care of him. But then she goes back into the tent. This chick drove a peg through his temple into the ground, and he died. And so it was prior to any doing that Deborah or Barak would have an involvement. So she says to Barak, I will show you the man you're looking for. So he went in with her, and there lay Sisera with the tent peg through his temple, dead. So Sisera was overtaken, and by the end of chapter 5 is the Song of Deborah, and it details her kind of that journey of victory, and the land had peace for 40 years after her. So the final line, which I think is significant, is verse 31 in chapter 5 of Judges. And she ends by saying, so may all your enemies perish, O Lord, but may they who love you be like the sun when it rises in its strength. And for me personally, that actually was such a significant verse to read, because a prophet, a person with the gift of prophecy, that's a whole other conversation, but somebody almost spoke those identical words to me many years ago, before I ever went into school leadership or anything. And I've heard people say Deborah spirit, like that person has a Deborah spirit. I never knew that maybe that could possibly come from this verse, because the person who spoke it into my life at a church used that same terminology to remind me and say, you're like the rising sun, and you have the favor of God, and you can be like the sun because it rises in its strength. It doesn't have to be about the power stuff with thunder, lightning, tornadoes, hurricanes, all that. So anyways, I'm down a rabbit trail, but that is so meaningful in my life, even to know that's the source of where it came from. And here's this woman who, she has these incredible attributes. She's very wise. She was a prophetess, a judge, and a creative. And she was all these beautiful things. But even when I was going back and reading these opening chapters of Judges, I'm like, I don't remember learning about any of this in Sunday school, or even on my own, right? So the Bible is coming alive in different ways, just like so many different influences this text can have in our life. But for me, this is very significant to dive into the work in the life of Deborah, and it's very inspiring to be looking at things in a new way, because I do know there are definitely interpretations who say, well, Barak was the one leading. Right. And so we look back at that. She also, and people dispute things too, because the judges Samuel, others, they're mentioned in Hebrews 11. However, her name isn't mentioned. So it says something like, and the other prophets and judges. She's just not mentioned in the slew of men that are mentioned. And so there's scholars who then discount, okay, well, was she really that significant? Was it really her? Or was it Barak, right? Barak was actually a young man who came to her. I also find it fascinating that at that time period, when you dive more into the Hebrew meaning of woman, and I don't want to butcher this, I'm using a source online for the Hebrew part as far as the translation, why some people get confused when it comes to how people use that word woman and wife. In Hebrew, it's the same word. So you really don't know when you're reading these particular chapters. And it says Deborah was a woman of Lapidoth, a place, or wife of Lapidoth, a person, because wife and woman actually mean the same. It's the same word that's used for woman and wife. And they say most likely she was married, but the whole reason in the Hebrew language that wife and woman weren't separate words in Deborah's day during that context, right? Look at how I'm reading it during that context, was because a female could only be one of three things: a virgin, a married woman, or a widow. So deciding to live single was not even on a list of options for a woman at that time. So just a differentiation, some of my own studying that I've been involved in, and I don't want this to be over 12 minutes, so I'm going to stop there.